onto today's teaching. This is Bernie Krause. You don't know Bernie Krause, but you've heard of his work. If you've ever watched a movie where there's any sort of nature sound or a documentary where you hear birds or whatever, he probably recorded it. He's a person that has recorded the most sounds of nature. And a few years ago, I was watching this video teaching, and they were referencing him. In an interview, he said that back in 1968, I'm guessing kind of like when he started doing this work, it would take him to get 1 hour of undisturbed natural sounds. So I'm talking like no planes going by, no cars, whatever. He would need to record for about 15 hours to get like 1 hour of usable sound. When he was kind of like giving this interview, it was like the early 2000s. At that point, he would need to record for 2,000 hours to get 1 hour of usable nature sounds. About 15 years ago, the WHO published a study where it concluded that in Europe, the second highest threat to public health, only below air pollution, was noise pollution. We live in a world where it is increasingly difficult to find any sort of quiet. But that's not the only noise that we face. If I were to ask you, what do you think is the most consequential year, say, of the last 25 years, right? Some of you will probably say, well, 2001, 9/11, that really changed the world. Some of you might say, well, 2020 because of 2020. The author, John Mark Comer, he has this book called The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. He proposes that actually perhaps one of the most transformational years we've had is the year 2007. 2007 is what some sociologists call now the start of the digital age. That's a year where Steve Jobs unleashed on the world this little thing that we call the iPhone. It's a year where Facebook no longer requires you to have a college email address to join it. It's the year where Twitter, that had started like a year before, became its own company. And we might say, well, those are normal things in the world today. But, some of you, probably like on the younger end of the spectrum here, you may not realize that there was a time where you couldn't be reached at all times. When you didn't have notifications about everything going on your phone all the time, where you didn't have access to all of the music and all of the movies and all of the TV shows and all of the podcasts and all of the information in the history of the world accessible to you immediately in the click of a button. And what sociologists are finding out is that the human brain, it's kind of like not designed to process the amount of inputs of information that we receive every day. And I could stay here, the rest of the time just reading to you all of the studies about the negative effects on our brain and our mental health because of the fact that we're living on the digital age, what it does to our focus, to our attention, to our self-esteem, you name it. A few years ago, there was this famous blogger. His name is Andrew Sullivan, and he had this kind of like one of the first paid blogging websites called The Dish. And randomly, at one point in 2015, he shut it down. And he shut it down because he said that he was feeling that, the saturation of the digital age was affecting his mental health. So he shuts it down. He checks into a monastery, and that's his sort of retreat. And he writes his essay, very famous now, called I Used to Be a Human Being, as, processing what his experiences were. And he says that part of the problem for him was that he didn't realize the trade-offs that we were making as a society for access to technology. So he says so much of it was irresistible, as I fully understood. So much of the technology was irreversible, I also knew. But I began to fear that this new way of living was actually becoming a way of not living. And the overarching point he's making is that in the digital world, with the immediate access we have to everybody and everything, has made us addicted to distraction. And that makes it harder and harder for us to engage in the real world with people. He goes on to say in that essay, this new epidemic of distraction is our civilization's specific weakness. And its threat is not so much to our minds, even as they shapeshift under the pressure. The threat is to our souls. At this rate, if the noise does not relent, we might even forget we have any. And here's a point, like there's some studies that attention spans have dropped. Like I read somewhere, it used to be about 12.5 seconds, and now the average attention span is 8 seconds. Last week, we started this series called Pause. And the point of the series was learning to slow down in the midst of the incredibly busy world that we live in so that we can, hear from God and we can experience true rest. And, one of the things I took away as I was listening to Chad last week was how the world, the way it's set up, it's like working completely against that, right? It's incredibly hard for us to find rest because of our work schedules and our commutes and our kids' sports activities and all of the things that come to, living in Northern Virginia in the 21st century. And, Chad mentioned in passing that that's not only true of our lifestyles, it's also true of the noise that we live in. Right? Not only like the actual, literal noise, but the amount of distractions and things competing to our attention at all times because we live in the digital age. No wonder that it is so hard to hit pause, not only because it's hard to slow down, but because it's hard to get quiet. And that's what we're going to talk about this morning. How do we find quietness in a world full of noise? So I want to invite you to go with me to the Gospel of Luke. I'm going to start reading on Luke chapter 5, verse 15. But despite Jesus' instructions, the report of his power spread even faster, and vast crowds came to hear him preach and to be healed of their diseases. And listen to verse 16. But Jesus often withdrew to the wilderness for prayer. The Greek word for wilderness in this passage is the word eremos. And eremos can be translated different ways. It can be translated as the wilderness, as in this passage. If you grew up kind of like an older, Bible translation, it's often translated as the desert or the deserted place, the solitary place, the lonely place. My favorite translation, the quiet place. The implication of Jesus going to the wilderness is not only going to a place that's kind of like withdrawn from civilization, that hasn't sort of like been tamed by nature, that there's no buildings or anything like that, but it's also, a place where Jesus could commune with his Father without noise in the quiet. And this is not an isolated incident. Like you can read all through the Gospels how this was a regular practice in the life of Jesus. Actually, what you're going to notice in the life of Jesus is that his ministry had this pattern of retreat and return. For as much time as Jesus was spending doing ministry, healing people, teaching, loving, oftentimes you're going to see that some version of what we just read, that Jesus often withdrew to the quiet place to pray and to hear from his Father. This practice that we see in the life of Jesus is something that the church kind of like throughout the years has come to call the practice of solitude, or the practice of silence and solitude. And what I want to propose to you today is that this might be the key that we need to be able to escape the noise, both the literal noise, but more importantly, the digital noise of all the distractions and notifications that we're bombarded with, so that we can slow down and be quiet and be able to properly hit pause. So let's start with a definition. What's exactly the practice of silence and solitude? The best definition I found comes from John Mark Comer and the people that practice in the way, and they define solitude this way: intentional time in the quiet to be alone with ourselves and with God. And I would argue that this is actually one of the most important spiritual practices, and probably the foundation of a flourishing life with God, and the best way that we have to fight against the noise and distraction in the world. And think about it, if life with God is about communion and relationship, you can't have an intimate life of communion and relationship with humans without time one-on-one, right? Like, think of a marriage where husband and wife are never alone by themselves. Or think of having a relationship with one of your children or with one of your parents where you're never just the two of you interacting. Why would it be any different with God? I would also argue that it is probably one of the most neglected spiritual practices in our time. And kind of makes sense to me because, we're talking about interacting with an invisible being that we don't really experience fully in the physical realm, Like, we're talking about having one-on-one conversations with people close in my life. I struggle sometimes when I'm having conversations with my wife or with my kids or with one of my parents. Even one-on-one, it can be hard. It can be awkward. And I can see them and hear them. Sometimes it's part of the problem. Now, try doing that with someone who you can see with your eyes or hear with your ears. No wonder that silence and solitude are so hard. And yet, Henry Nouwen, one of the kind of like leading luminaries in the spiritual formation world, said, without solitude, it's virtually impossible to live a spiritual life. Learning to practice silence and solitude might just be the thing that helps us not only escape from the noise that we live in, but also to experience God in a much deeper way than we currently do. And I would argue the way that He wants us to experience His love. So, what I want to do for the rest of our time today is explore why silence and solitude is so important and how we actually do it. So, come with me to the book of 1 Kings chapter 19. And to give you a little bit of background, we're going into the story of a guy named Elijah. Elijah is a prophet. He's a prophet to the northern kingdom of Israel. The king of Israel at the time is a guy named Ahab. He's not a good dude. He's married to a woman named Jezebel. Jezebel is actually not from the nation of Israel. She's from the Phoenician kingdom. She hates Yahweh, the God of Israel. She worships a God named Baal. And actually, when she marries Ahab, she kind of like institutes the worship of Baal over the worship of Yahweh in Israel. And kind of like as a retaliation for that, God tells Elijah to pray so that it stops raining over the nation of Israel. So for 3 years at this point, it has not rained. And things reach such a climax that Elijah has a showdown with the prophets of Baal where, the God, Yahweh, the God of Israel, comes out victorious. Rain falls from the sky. Elijah kills like 400 prophets. It turns into like a Game of Thrones scene for a second in there. And in the aftermath of that, Queen Jezebel tells Elijah that she's basically put out a bounty to kill him. So she's going to have assassins come after him. And Elijah panics. Elijah responds to that by running for his life. He goes into kind of like a manic depressive episode. He's suicidal. It's this whole very, very complicated thing. And he gets to the point that Elijah gets to a cave where he has an encounter with God. And in this cave, Elijah just unleashes on God and starts telling God all that's wrong, all that he suffered. And he's basically like, I'm out. I've done this thing. I'm tired. I'm not making a difference. And now they want to kill me. I'm out. And this is where we pick up the story. So 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 11. Go out and stand before me on the mountain, the Lord told him. And as Elijah stood there, the Lord passed by. And a mighty windstorm hit the mountain. It was such a terrible blast that the rocks were torn loose, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, there was a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, there was the sound of a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And a voice said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" There's 1,000 fascinating things going on here. At some point, I want to do like a series just on this encounter between God and Elijah. First of all, it kind of feels incredibly inefficient because if you read the story, Elijah gets to this cave and God shows up in the cave. And they start talking, and Elijah kind of has his say. And if I'm God, I'm like, I have other places to be. I can just answer you now, right? But God is like, no, I want you to go out of the cave and meet me outside in the mountain. And this is when we have this fascinating encounter where all these forces of nature show up. And you know what? I don't know why God chose to do it this way, but I'm grateful for it because this gives us a window into what it's like to commune with God and why silence and solitude matters. Elijah gets out of the cave and there's all these big demonstrations of the power of nature. And it's funny that every time it says, but God wasn't in it. And what's interesting is that this mountain where Elijah is actually a mountain in the history of Israel where people have had encounters with God. And they've usually been encounters with God with big demonstrations of nature's power, right? Like earthquakes and wind and smoke and fire. And yet here, Story says like that's not where God was speaking. God was speaking in the gentle whisper. The language there is interesting because, there you have like, the word for gentle is kind of like the word to be still, but then the word for whisper can also be translated as that. You could kind of say that God was present in the sound of stillness. My favorite translation of this passage is the NRSV that says that God was in the sound of sheer silence. What does God's voice sound like? I grew up in the charismatic tradition, and I'm from there, so I don't want to sound like I'm making fun of this, but the way in which I grew up, it was normal for people to say like, God told me. God told me this, God told me to tell you this, the Lord said this. And I'm not denying those experiences, but I always wanted to ask, kind of like, so what does God's voice sound like? Like, is it like high pitch, low pitch? Like, does he have an accent? Is it like a little bit of Hebrew in there? What's going on, right? No. Again, I'm not going to make light of them, but like we use this language to talk about communing with God, and we're really kind of like communing with a being that we don't communicate in normal terms. Like the Bible says that God's spirit, that God doesn't have vocal cords, which is how we make sound. So when we say we heard from God, most of the time we're talking about we had some sort of experience where we feel like God said something to us that wasn't probably in terms of audible noise. It's so hard to engage with God because it's a being that we don't fully experience in our five senses. Now, that wasn't always the case. If you read the Bible, you go back to like the book of Genesis. In Genesis 3, right after the fall, there's this line, kind of like throwaway. It says that God was walking around the garden in the cool of the day. And the implication seems to be that before the fall, the communion that humans had with God was such that it felt like just God was walking around. And that we could just experience him like we're experiencing each other now. And one of the things that happened because of the fall is that whatever kind of like overlap between the spiritual realm and the physical realm has kind of like starting to like drift away to where now it's so hard for us to be aware of what's going on in the spiritual realm. This is a very poor analogy, but any of you remember like grew up not having cable and definitely not having streaming? Did any of you have like that big antenna on the top of the roof, and if it was raining or something and like you wanted to watch the game, your dad would get on the roof and he starts like moving antenna and he's like yelling at you from the roof, did you get the signal? Can you see? It's like, no, it's still raining. And they keep moving and he's cussing and I get angry. Now, my dad didn't do that, okay? But anyway, what's fascinating about that is like it's a way of capturing this image, right? Like sometimes now hearing from God feels like trying to get a signal that we can't really fully get there, right? Or like talking to somebody from like a radio transmitter and there's something wrong in the frequency and it comes like muffled and we don't fully understand what's going on. And in our end, what we interpret this as is God isn't there. Why is God so absent? Why can I feel God's presence at the moment I need it the most? And actually, what if God has actually been speaking all the time? And because we're so distracted, and because our minds are going in so many different ways, and because we've never making time to just sit with God and wait for God in silence and solitude, that we can't hear what God is saying to us. And all over the Bible, you're going to see this idea that apparently one of the main ways in which God communicates with people is in the context of silence and solitude. Because it's only there when we stop paying attention to other things and we stop letting distractions get into our mind where the Holy Spirit can start working in our hearts to help us tune in to the presence of God and to hear what God is saying. Cardinal Robert Serra, he was one of the person at the Vatican in charge of overseeing like all of the liturgy of the Catholic Church. And he has this book on silence, and he has this fascinating quote, how he opens the book. He says this: there is one great question. How can man really be in the image of God? He must enter into silence. When he drapes himself in silence, as God himself dwells in a great silence. Man is close to heaven, or rather, he allows God to manifest himself in him. We encounter God only in the eternal silence in which he abides. And if that's true, if God is waiting for us in silence and in solitude, in the gentle whisper of his presence. How do we tune into that? When I first started learning about silence and solitude, my first thought was like, well, isn't just like a quiet time? You know what I'm saying? Like, if you grew up in the evangelical world, like, you had some version of this, right? Like, you take some time in the morning and you pray and you read your Bible. If you're like really spiritual, like you listen to a song. If you're really, really spiritual, you journal a little bit. You know what I'm saying? Like, for me, it was worse because I grew up, again, charismatic tradition. So Saturday mornings, my parents had their quiet time, except that their quiet time was anything but quiet, right? They would read a Bible passage aloud, and they would like proclaim and declare and decree and like cast out demons. And the thing is that if you woke up while they were doing that, you had to sit, like they would like call you, like sit down in here and pray with us. You just had to sit there and listen to them. And listen, I love Jesus, but I'm 8 years old, man. I want my chocolate milk and to watch some cartoons. Like, I don't want to listen to you like pray for an hour. So I kind of like hated Saturday mornings. I tried to like hide so that they wouldn't see me and I could escape the prayer time. The one thing that most of us, particularly in like the evangelical tradition, are not good at is usually being quiet in our quiet time. And that's for a number of reasons, right? A is because it's awkward. It can be uncomfortable. For some of us, the last thing that we want to do is to sit alone with our thoughts. That's terrifying. It can be disappointing. What if we do it and nothing happens? Does that mean that God's mad at us or that there's something wrong with me and I'm the only one that can't experience the presence of God? It can also be terrifying because what if God actually says something, right? But most of the time, the main reason why we're not actually good at being quiet is plainly just because we're so very easily distracted. We slot God into one of the other 50 things that we're thinking about. And we read a verse of the day, and our prayer is like, God, sorry for this, thank you for this, help me with that, and we're at the door. And I'm describing what my prayer life is some days. And the irony is that a lot of times, like preachers, we encourage that. And we encourage that because we would rather you pray a little bit than not pray at all. And that's important and that matters. But if that's all that your spiritual life is, the reality is that there are depths to life with God. And there's a level of understanding of who God is and of who you are that you're going to miss out on. And that doesn't mean that God loves you any less. And that doesn't mean that God is like less impressed with you. No, it's nothing of that. It's just that there's things that we can only understand and see and hear when we wait for God in the silence and in the quiet. So when I'm talking about silence and solitude, what I'm talking about is kind of like going beyond a little bit just praying and reading your Bible, but making time when you're with God to be just with God and listen to Him and clear your mind and make yourself available to Him. So, what does that actually look like? And again, I'm heavily borrowing from the wonderful folks at Practicing the Way. I think that there are 3 key elements to the practice of solitude. Number 1 is, solitude, right? So, a quick word on solitude, silence, and stillness. So, first, solitude. In order to understand what solitude is, we have to understand what solitude isn't, okay? So what solitude isn't, it's not loneliness, okay? Some of you might be listening to me and you're thinking to yourself, man, like I'm single and I don't have that many friends and I spend most of the time by myself. The last thing I want to hear is I have to spend more time by myself. And what I would say is actually loneliness is in many ways like the opposite of solitude, because loneliness is kind of like the pain for the lack of community. Solitude is actually making space for, honestly, the ultimate community, which is a community with God. Richard Foster says loneliness is inner emptiness. Solitude is inner fulfillment. Second thing is that solitude is not isolation. Wayne Cordeiro is a pastor in Hawaii. He says this: there is a difference between isolation and solitude. They may contain similar characteristics, but in reality, they are worlds apart. Solitude is a chosen separation for refining your soul. Isolation is what you crave when you neglect the first. And what he's saying is that isolation is kind of like the toxic version of solitude. That isolation is running away from community, wanting to be separate from people, including God. Solitude is actually the pursuit of community with you're seeking God. Finally, solitude is not aloneness. What do I mean by aloneness? Aloneness, John Marcomer says, aloneness is me time for introverts. Okay? Some of you, that this sounds awesome. You know why it sounds awesome? Because you want to be by yourself, with nobody to bother you, with nobody talking, so you can read your book. And you can listen to your audiobook, and you can watch Netflix, and you can scroll on TikTok. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, we don't want to be with people, but we also don't want to be present in the moment. We just want to be like distract ourselves in a way that kind of like fills our time. There's nothing wrong with that. That's just not solitude. Like solitude goes a little bit beyond that. John Marcomer describes it this way. He says, one way to think about solitude is a place that's free of all inputs. The only inputs are God and your own heart laid open before God. Jesus kind of like says the same thing on Matthew 6. He says, but when you pray, go away by yourself. Shut the door behind you and pray to your Father in private. Then your Father who sees everything will reward you. So, that's the first element, solitude. We're retreating from other people, but we're doing so in such a way that we are present in the moment. We're not being distracted by any other things. Maybe that can be in nature. That's awesome. Maybe it's like you go for a run, you go for a walk. Maybe it's in your office and you can close your door and be by yourself. Whatever, a place in your house. It's less about the place than the posture of the heart and how you're limiting inputs. And then there's this idea that, when you're solitude and you're free for all inputs, that's easier said than done, which takes me to the second element, right? Silence. And there's two kind of like levels of silence. One is external silence. And external silence is all about, shutting down the noise that we've been talking about. Not literally just the sound, but the distractions, the notifications, the updates, the text messages, the emails, the memes, the group chats. And in the spirit of full disclosure, I am absolutely terrible at that. Okay? So, usually I have my quiet time in my office, and my office is like this ginormous monitor screen. And I cannot tell you how many times I've put on my head, so it's like I'm going to listen to a worship song to kind of get into a worshipful moment. And I go on YouTube. And 15 minutes of cat videos later, I remember why I put on my headphone in the same place, because I wanted to listen to a worship song. Or I used to use a Bible app on my phone because I really like this app, and it kind of helped me at that time. But the problem was that I didn't silence my notifications. So I'm reading the app and I'm getting a text message and I'm getting a notification for this, notification for that. And I can never really kind of center my mind on what I'm trying to hear. So part of external silence is shutting down all those inputs. And then there's the element of internal silence. It's much harder to shut down the internal chatter that's always going in your brain. The anxious thoughts, the worries, the fears, the memories, all of these things. Now, that in and of itself, it's a longer conversation, so I'm actually not going to talk about this much. Chad, next week, part of his message is kind of dealing with this, why we're so afraid of silence and how we want to deal with this. So I'll let him do that. So if you want to listen about learning to quiet all of the inner talk that's full of anxiety and insecurity and fear and dread about life, then join us next Sunday for an encouraging and uplifting message on WGTS 95.1, okay? Now, so silence. Then there's stillness. On the other end of silence and solitude, when we get alone with God and when we quiet kind of the noise and the distraction from the outside, there's a place that we can get where we're actually fully present to God, where our mind isn't going in 50 different directions, when for a second the things that keep us up at night are kind of lowered in volume enough that we can hear from God. There's an Orthodox bishop that says it this way: stillness is a state of inner tranquility or mental quietude and concentration, not simply silence, but an attitude of listening to God and of an openness to God. This is what some people call silent prayer or contemplative prayer. That there's a way of praying before God where words are not needed anymore, because God knows what's going on in our souls. And us making ourselves aware, available to God, allows God to speak deeper than maybe even our minds can understand, to the place of our heart and our soul. Dan Rather, the CBS anchor, was interviewing Mother Teresa once. And he's asking Mother Teresa, hey, what do you say to God when you pray? And she answered, I listen. And then you can tell that Dan Rather's kind of like annoyed by that. So he says, okay, well, what does God say, right? And she smiles at him, and she says, he listens. A few years ago, I was at a conference, and I'm hearing Rich Villodas is a pastor. He was talking about this story, and he kind of like pursuing this idea of silent prayer or contemplative prayer. And he says this: silent prayer is listening to God, listening to me. The God of the universe wants to make time for you, for the deepest anxieties and fears in your heart. And he wants to just sit and listen to you. And he has things that he wants to say and minister to you, and he invites you to just sit and listen to him. And what I believe is that the most transformational work that God does in our lives begins there. The revelations about God's purpose for our lives, about God's love for us, about our identity, they start there. How does Psalm 23 start? The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. Then he says, he makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. Can I be honest with you for a second? I struggle preaching messages like this because my assumption is that most people, even in a church setting, they're not up at night wondering how they can develop a practice of silence and solitude. You have all this stuff in your mind, right? Like, let Chad, go to a monastery and learn to levitate. Like, I have bills to pay and I have things to do. I cannot make time for this. But if I told you that, the stuff that you're carrying with you, the fear and the anxiety and the worries and the exhaustion and like the internal noise that's killing you. What if I tell you that God wants to take that from you and give you peace? That version of the psalm that he wants you to lay down and enjoy these green pastures and these quiet waters are available to you if you make time in your life to wait for God in the silence and the solitude. And this is the thing, guys. The thing about spiritual practices are meant to kind of like train us for a larger transformation. That it's not only about the fact that we're doing this and making time for God, but that somehow that is what shapes our hearts and our minds to the point that the noise of the world becomes less necessary. The notifications and the stimulation and the inputs become less satisfactory to us because we found this deeper satisfaction. And what the world actually needs right now is that. Andrew Sullivan, the blogger I mentioned at the beginning, he closes his essay saying this: if the churches came to understand that the greatest threat to faith today is not hedonism but distraction, perhaps they might begin to appeal anew to a frazzled digital generation. Christian leaders seem to think that they need more distraction to counter the distraction. Their services have degenerated into emotional spasms. Their spaces drowned with light and noise and locked shut throughout the day, when their darkness and silence might actually draw those whose minds and souls have grown web weary. What if the answer to the noise that we live in is the silence that God invites us to step into? So I want to close the time doing something a little bit different. I want to invite you to stand up for a second. I'm going to take communion after this, so grab your communion kit. But as you stand up, I want to invite you to do something. Close your eyes for just a second. Close your eyes. Take a deep breath with me. Just inhale through your nose. Hold your breath for a second. Now exhale through your mouth. And try to focus your image, your mind, in the vision of Jesus as the Good Shepherd. Imagine maybe that you are down by some quiet waters and green meadows. And wait in silence for him for just a second. Let me read this over you. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. And I shall dwell in the house of the Lord